My, you're well behaved. Good evening. I'm Elaine Petruccelli, and along with my colleague, Ginger Gamali Hudson, we're really happy to welcome you tonight to Book Passage and also to C-SPAN for Book TV. Because we are on Book TV tonight, when it comes time to answer questions, Mr. Turner will call on people, but it may take a minute or two for the man with the C-SPAN mic to get to you, so there'll be a couple of seconds before he can answer. I know that that'll work out really well. So I know that you've all gone out and had your hair done, and we're all ready. Yeah. I'm really happy to be the one to introduce Mr. Turner tonight. I have read his articles over the years, and I am amazed at this book. A lot of you know about him, but I want to tell you a little bit. He joined the FBI in 1951, and he was a stellar FBI agent who went to all of the schools to learn how to break and enter and to destroy your privacy. He received many accolades from the then highly admired J. Edgar Hoover. But in time, he became quite disenchanted with Mr. Hoover and the way that the FBI was run. And he turned in his service revolver for a typewriter and became a great investigative journalist. I believe it is because of William Turner that the FBI now requires that you sign something, and I think the CIA too, saying you will never say another word without their approval. As a journalist, he works to ferret out the truth and shoot down the myths. He has exposed malfeasance in our government, in the CIA, in the FBI, in some of the most important myths and lies of our time, the Kennedy assassination. And by the way, when he was doing his investigative work on the Kennedy assassination, the Hoover FBI put more people on watching William Turner than on trying to figure out who had killed JFK. The Robert Kennedy killings, the King killings, and when you read this book, you will find new and shocking information. Information about Charles de Gaulle, trying to make sure that JFK got elected. Operation Chaos with the farm workers and Cesar Chavez, where everything was being done to discredit him and them. The operations in Cuba, even to the Elian Gonzalez case, and to our current administration. His information is detailed, it is important. There will be people who don't like the book, and I loved it. So I cannot tell you how much fun it is to read Rearview Mirror, looking back at the FBI, the CIA, and other tales, T-A-I-L-S. But more important than that, history will look at this book as an important chronicle of what really happened in the last part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. It shows how abuse and manipulation in the past affect the present, and it is very important. So I am proud to welcome William Turner to Book Passage tonight.
Thanks, Elaine, for your very generous introduction. And I hope that the book lives up to the expectations that you raised for it. And thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you, Elaine, for inviting me to Book Passage. I got some illustrations here I'll be using later. A few weeks ago, I was on with Phil Mateer on television, and we were discussing the FBI. And I told his producer beforehand, I can't talk as fast as Phil. She said, nobody can. So if I don't talk that fast, I hope you'll understand that I'm not Phil Matier. The book actually is a cautionary tale in that all of the events described about the intelligence mafia in the United States come together to sound a warning to this day. The book is divided into 13 chapters, and I can talk a thumbnail sketch of each one. The first chapter is my abortive career as an FBI agent. I came in all bushy-tailed, thinking that the FBI was the greatest law enforcement organization in the world. And I left disillusioned that it wasn't. The problem was the Red Scare in those days. Hoover was making a big fuss about communist USA and ignoring organized crime because some of his buddies were mobbed up. And when I made an issue of this inside the FBI, I became the first whistleblower. I wrote to Congress, poking the tiger from inside the cage, asking for a congressional investigation of the FBI. Well, 40 years later, there may be one. In the meantime, I saw that the Bureau was developing willy-nilly by its own light. Congress did not have a firm hand on the steering wheel. It was driving practically no-handed. The FBI did what it wanted, so did the CIA, and that's what we have today. The blunder after blunder after blunder, and they're not doing their job. So my recommendation was 30 years ago, and it persists to this day, that they do more extreme psychological testing to get a better grade of agent in there, and that they separate or spin off the espionage and counter-espionage responsibilities into a separate agency that recruits more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan people for the very slow, nuanced investigations that we're talking about when we're talking counter-espionage and espionage. The second chapter is Oswald and the JFK story, the big story. When John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, the national magazine Saga was doing a profile on me as the FBI's first whistleblower. And the editors changed the assignment, had me go running down to Dallas as fast as possible to cover the assassination from the standpoint of the breakdown in security. And what I found was that 10 days before the assassination, FBI agents had talked to Lee Harvey Oswald. The Warren Commission said this came under the heading of rumors and was unsubstantiated. But in fact, they did. And in fact, I also found out from an FBI source that the FBI had been running Oswald as a potential security informant, a PSI, which meant that he was under FBI control at the time of the assassination, and accounted for the fact that the FBI did not turn over his name to the Secret Service, which had primary responsibility for presidential protection. The thing that Oswald was informing on was a Neutrality Act, the gun running there for a second Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, about which more I will talk in another chapter. But at any rate, Oswald as an FBI informant throws a whole new light on his role in the assassination. Chapter 3, Bugs and Black Bags. My favorite anecdotes are lodged in this chapter. The FBI conducted lawless law enforcement. The wiretaps were approved by the Attorney General, but the bugs were not. And believe me, they were promiscuous. The black bag jobs, I was trained in burglary, called surreptitious entry, at a sound school, which was not exactly a finishing school. The instructor, whose name was George Burley, taught me everything about breaking and entering in order to photograph documents, steal documents, and gather evidence and intelligence. And these were also uncontrolled by the Attorney General. The black bag jobs were not known to the Attorney Generals. They were lawless, and they were run on the Hoover's authority only. I remember being in the basement of a house after having picked the lock and gone in to plant a bug, and hearing footsteps in the floors above me. And I cringed and wondered if those footsteps would come down to the basement stairs. And I decided what to do. I had no identification as an FBI agent, and I was supposed to deny that I was with the FBI if I was caught. So there was a consensus among those of us who did the black bag jobs that we would simply act like burglars and knock out whoever intruded upon us. So I think I got a dose of what all of this was about when George Burley told me, well, Bill, you're from the Seattle office. Possession of burglary tools in the state of Washington can get you 7 years. That jarred me into the reality that we were engaging in lawless law enforcement, and I became a critic of that type of law enforcement. In fact, when I wrote an article in Ramparts after leaving the FBI, exposing the lawlessness in bugging and tapping and wiretaps and black bag jobs, Hoover stopped them. Ramparts Redux, blowing the CIA's cover. The CIA was operating in the 60s a bunch of domestic organizations such as the Asia Society, the American Federation of Teachers, the Kaplan Fund, and various nonprofit organizations as conduits for funds going to the focus of their activity at that time, which was the Caribbean and the Castro regime. And Ramparts blew the cover. We had informants inside the National Students Association, for example, which informed to us what was going on and giving us enough information that the whole operation could be exposed. Well, the CIA found out about it, that we knew about the NSA, and they were going to hold a press conference to try to marginalize the whole thing in a limited hangout. But what happened was Warren Hinkle, the genius editor of Ramparts, got the idea of taking out full-page ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post, laying out the whole story. So we preempted the CIA, and all their covers then just fell like a row of dominoes. They were mad. And they turned inward, despite their charter limiting them to overseas service operations. They turned inward and launched Operation Chaos. My CIA file shows Operation Chaos, and then it's all black. So I don't know what they did to me. But there was an Operation Disruption, and according to the Freedom of Information Act documents, attempts to close down Ramparts by getting at our finances and shutting off our lifeblood of newsstand sales. The FBI propaganda machine. Catherine Kelly was the wife of Machine Gun Kelly. Back in 1933, Machine Gun Kelly kidnapped Charles Urschel, an oil man in Oklahoma City. and took our shell around the country, and finally the FBI found him when they found about a plane flying overhead of a ranch, and it was one of the FBI's great stories. The FBI also prosecuted his wife, Catherine Kelly, who denied being responsible for anything, and Hoover called her the genius behind the crime, the strong, silent woman. I mean, this guy was a sexist from the word go, without whom Kelly could do nothing. The problem was there was an FBI laboratory report that said Catherine Kelly did not write the ransom notes, and that was the only evidence they had against her, was an accusation that she wrote the ransom notes. So the FBI for 25 years denied the existence. When I was in the Oklahoma City office, a senior agent came up to me and gave me the lab report with an accompanying note that when a federal judge ordered her released until the FBI produced their file, the FBI was not going to produce their file because it might embarrass the Bureau. So she was in a legal limbo for all those years. The Farewell America plot. Elaine mentioned de Gaulle, and in fact, this Farewell America was a book produced by French intelligence with the authorization of de Gaulle in an attempt to influence the Bobby Kennedy campaign. The book was published in Europe. They were attempting to get an American edition published, and it alleged that there was a vast conspiracy of the military-industrial complex to kill John F. Kennedy, and the whole operation, the whole project was aimed at influencing Bobby Kennedy's election. Well, as soon as Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, French intelligence folded its tent, but not without getting to me a copy of the Zapruder film, the famous film which shows Kennedy being rocked violently back in the seat cushion of his limousine at Dealey Plaza. And the indication from that is that a shot came from a frontal zone. So the French wanted to get that out. I showed it at college campuses around the country, and instead of being the proprietary property of Life magazine, it became the domain of the American people, which deserved to see it in motion picture form, which the Warren Commission never did. The Garrison Commission, I was an investigator for Jim Garrison at the same time I was writing for Ramparts. From my FBI experience, I know he had a very valid investigation, and I helped him as much as I could, but the whole dice were loaded against him. The CIA had an Operation Nightingale, which was to suppress any information that would indicate there was a conspiracy in the John F. Kennedy assassination, and also to beat down any representation that Garrison had a legitimate case. The FBI at the same time was wiretapping and bugging him and calling on its press assets to smear him. So Garrison really, in the public light, never had a chance. And that's a reason that until JFK, the movie, came along with Oliver Stone, that the American people really thought that he was some kind of a charlatan who was prosecuting Kay Shaw for sexual reasons, which was totally untrue. Jim was a very sensitive guy, and he would not have done anything like that. The media circus documents Operation Nightingale and the media assault on Garrison to try and destroy his investigation. Deadly Secrets, a stealth war against Cuba. At the time that John Kennedy was assassinated, two things were going on, parallel tracks. Bobby Kennedy was conducting an operation called Mongoose, which was aimed at destabilizing Cuba and conducting military commando assaults on its shores, destroying military installations, all with an eye towards the eventual second invasion of Cuba, conducted by my informant, Harry Williams, and his force from the Dominican Republic, and a man by the name of Manuel Artemi from Nicaragua. That was all set to go. In fact, the infiltrations had started when John Kennedy was killed. The parallel track was that John Kennedy was carrying on secret negotiations through his trusted aide, Bill Atwood, to normalize relations with Cuba. And in fact, they had gotten to a point where when he was killed, before he left for Dallas, he said, "I want this finalized after a short trip to Dallas." Well, he never returned from Dallas alive. And Lyndon Johnson, as relayed by E. Howard Hunt, told Harry Williams, "I don't want a thing to do with you goddamn Cubans." So he turned his sights towards Vietnam. And therein may lie the secret, as Gorbachev said, as to Kennedy's death. Escape from the CIA. This is a helicopter escape from the Mexico City jail in 1971. And the escapee was Joel Kaplan. His uncle had the Kaplan Fund, which was a CIA conduit, exposed as a CIA conduit later on. But Joel worked for the family sugar interests around the Caribbean, and he was very sympathetic to the Cuban Revolution because he saw the extreme poverty under Batista, the dictator. And what he was doing was using the family sugar facilities, Southwestern Sugar and Molasses facilities, to steer arms and ammunition consigned to the Bay of Pigs contingent in Nicaragua to pro-Castro units in the Caribbean, arming them instead of the CIA's Bay of Pigs. So he was a naughty boy, as the CIA described him. And they had to frame him, put him in prison. The cadaver that was produced as his business partner was 20 years older, 6 feet, as opposed to 5'2", blue eyes as opposed to brown. But that was the way Mexico operated at the behest of the CIA. And so I knew about the escape plans before they were carried out. There was a series of them, and finally the one was successful with a smuggler named Vic Stoddard flying a helicopter into the prison yard and lifting Joel Kaplan out to freedom. So waiting at the border when they arrived were the inevitable Bill Turner and Warren Hinkle. It was made into the movie called Breakout with Charles Bronson and Jill Ireland. And they bought the copyright to the book, which is the way things work in Hollywood. The only problem was that the CIA put pressure on Columbia Pictures, and the CIA was entirely deleted from the motion picture. What was a significant political film turned out to be a potboiler adventure. That is what happens when the CIA flexes its muscles. So the one case I haven't mentioned that's in the book, and Elaine brought it up, is the Bobby Kennedy case. RFK is dead, proclaimed the newspaper headline. And this was just as Bobby had claimed victory in the California primary in 1968. and was set to end the Vietnam War once he became president. He was also set to reopen the investigation of his brother's death by controlling the Justice Department. I say untimely death because of the exquisite timing of his assassination. If he had been assassinated earlier, it would have been useless to talk about him ending the Vietnam War. But after Bobby Kennedy was killed, the pundit said, well, he would have gone on to become president of the United States, that he would have gotten the nomination, the Democratic nomination from Hubert Humphrey in Washington, or in Chicago, and that he would have then gone on to beat Richard Nixon in the general election in November. Since he was killed, most of the 58,000 American boys who were killed in Vietnam, the majority of them were killed after Nixon assumed power. Not to mention how many Vietnamese kids were killed. So at first I said, well, this looks like an open and shut case. We have a guy caught red-handed, smoking gun. He was able to squeeze off 8 shots. That's all the cylinder held. He was overpowered before he could reload. He assaulted Kennedy from the front. That's it. The LAPD crime lab, which we now know is kind of corrupt, accounted for all the bullets, all 8 bullets. One was lost in the ceiling interspace. Another was, the other 7, as a matter of fact, were all recovered from the bodies of the various victims. Kennedy was the only one that was killed. And that ended it as far as the LAPD was concerned. They set up a special unit senator to investigate the case, and all they did was cover it up. It was run by 2 LAPD detectives called Special Unit Senator, and those 2 LAPD detectives had been on detached duty with the CIA in South America. Then came the arithmetic. 8 bullets, all accounted for. But the problem was there were more than 8 bullets. Here's Coroner Noguchi of the LA County. He's pointing to 1 extra. Vince Bugliosi, who was representing Paul Schrade, the UAW representative who was shot in the pantry, recovered one from a cop who had picked it out of the stairs downrange from the pantry. So we were on to the idea that there might have been more than 1 shooter. The count came to 10 or more. I'm reading here from a declaration furnished by Dr. Michael H.L. Hecker, who did the Watergate tapes. He's an acoustical expert. He was with the Stanford Research Institute, and we commissioned him to do a study of the audio tapes. So this is his report. During the week of November 15th, 1982, and again during the week of December 13th, 1982, I examined 3 tape recordings, which I was informed were made by news reporters covering the victory speech of Senator Robert F. Kennedy given at the Ambassador Hotel on June 5th, 1968. The recordings were labeled with the names of the news reporters. West Tape, Andrew West, Mutual Broadcasting Company. Smith Tape, Howard K. Smith / Bill Lawrence, American Broadcasting Company. Brent Tape, Jeff Brent, affiliation unknown. So Dr. Hecker goes on to say, on the basis of auditory, oscilloscope, and spectrographic analyses of these 3 recordings, it is my opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that no fewer than 10 gunshots are ascertainable following the conclusion of the senator's victory speech until after the time Bashar Saran was disarmed. So there we have at least 10 shots. The geometry, that was the arithmetic. The geometry was this. Senator Kennedy was hit by 3 shots from behind. The fatal shot was 1 to 3 inches upward coursing to the rear of the head. Saran never got closer than 3 feet at the front. I think you can see in this photo that I showed you earlier, the newspaper photo, this is a bow tie. It was on one of the armed security guards who was right to the right rear of Kennedy at the time that he was shot. And he obviously had grasped it away from what he considered his attacker. So Vince Bugliosi made the comment, the time has come to look for the members of the firing squad that night. The Manchurian candidate theory came up when I noticed that an interview of Saran, I interviewed him in 1975 in San Quentin prison, and he told me that he remembered nothing that night from the time that he met a girl in a polka dot dress at a silver coffee urn in the Ambassador Hotel until he was overpowered in the pantry, which is self-serving, of course, but also it put me on the trail of the Manchurian candidate theory. At Saran's trial, a Dr. Bernard Diamond of Berkeley stated that he was able to hypnotize Saran so easily that he would snap his fingers and Saran would climb the bars of his cell like a monkey. But he somewhat gratuitously said that Saran was under hypnotic influence at the time that the crime was committed, but that the hypnotic induction was caused by all the lights and mirrors in the Ambassador Hotel that night. I talked to the psychiatrist at San Quentin Prison, Dr. Simpson Callis, and he said that he was European trained and more alert to hypnotic induction. And he said that he found that Saran was indeed susceptible to hypnotic induction, and he was trying to find the locking mechanism that he was used, like the Queen of Spades, the Queen of Hearts, and the Manchurian candidate, that kept him from identifying his programmer. So he said he was close to unlocking Saran's mind as to that aspect when he was called off the case by prison authorities who said he was spending too much time with one prisoner. So he called Diamond's conclusion that it was self-induced the hypnotic blunder of the century. So who is the suspect for programming? Well, the CIA had a program during the 50s, experimentation called MK Ultra and mind control. And this gentleman here, Dr. William Joseph Bryan Jr., was part of it, and in fact, he even bragged about it. But the important thing to know about Dr. Bryan is that he was in civilian practice, and one of his most famous cases was the Boston Strangler case. DeSalvo was the name of the strangler. He's still in prison. And up here, written while in a hypnotic trance, is Saran's notebook. It says DeSalvo, 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 DeSalvo. It also said RFK must die before June 5th. So Dr. Bryan, after he died, some ladies of the night were kind enough to come forth and tell us that he constantly boasted about hypnotically inducing Saran. And they thought that he induced Saran. He was a braggart, and he needed to blow off about his deeds as a psychiatrist and a hypnotist. He bragged about the DeSalvo case, and he bragged about putting Saran under. And they thought he meant after he was apprehended, but he was talking about before. So he's our prime suspect as the programmer. At the present time, Saran's attorney, Larry Teeter, has a motion before the California Supreme Court for an evidentiary hearing. And the hearing will consist of the Manchurian Candidate theory. So we can hope that the Supreme Court does grant an evidentiary hearing. I think we know a lot more about hypnotic induction today than we did 30 years ago, and that it's real, and that it happens, and that it happened in the Bobby Kennedy case. So again, thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your interest. I hope you will understand that what we're talking about here is an intelligence mafia that persists to this day. So as Publishers Weekly said about the book, while some of the events described happened years ago, they are just as fresh and lively today. Thanks again.
Do we have some questions?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. You have a wonderful story. I wanted to ask you a question about how to have a Freedom of Information Act performed. And is there 3 people in Marin County that you might be able to suggest I get in touch with who can inform me if I'm being tracked or traced?
If you're being tracked, you want to get documents under the Freedom of Information Act?
Yes.
You have to ask the specific agency, if it's the FBI.
But there are 5 or 6 different agencies with all their security things, and I know that I made an initial inquiry many years ago which indicated I should indicate every place that I have lived. And I am 62 years old, and I've had about 65 jobs in my life, and I can't remember all the places that I've lived.
Well, they'll use it, if you don't give them the information, they'll use it as an excuse for saying I can't identify this person.
But the point is that I'm emotionally involved in it myself, and I want to find somebody that can help me do it. Is there anybody that can do it for me?
Well, there are attorneys that specialize that. I don't have any in my hip pocket as to which specific ones, but there are.
What are the key words for the attorney, or the title, or how to identify them?
The Freedom of Information Act.
Freedom of Information attorneys?
Yeah. There are attorneys that's a specialty with them. They're mostly in Washington.
Oh. That's where all the information is, obviously.
Yes. Very good.
Thank you for your service.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of the existence of a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald and LBJ's sister?
No, I'm not. Can you tell me about it?
Privately.
Okay. Fair enough. Yes.
I was interested in some comments about what happened at Wounded Knee. I had read some accounts that there had been a political assassination program of members of the American Indian movement with the help of the FBI working on the intertribal level, that something like 30 or 40 members of the movement had been murdered leading up to the Wounded Knee incident, and also specifically anything about Leonard Peltier.
Well, Leonard Peltier deserves a new trial. I think there's a paucity of evidence that he killed the 2 FBI agents. I conducted defense investigation for the American Indian movement at Wounded Knee right after it happened. And I worked the Custer cases, as they call it. And as far as the present situation, however, I'm not up to date on it, so I can't answer that. Yes, sir.
Would you care to comment on the series of revelations of FBI bungling in the laboratory that have come to light in the last couple of years?
In the laboratory?
Well, not only the laboratory bungling, but this recent case of loss of laptops and so on. I mean, it sounds to me like they don't have very good management systems.
Well, the Attorney General has just hired at a cost of $700,000 the Anderson Company to straighten them out on how to keep a computer inventory. So, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is we got to go back to ground zero with the FBI and start over, because it got off to a bad start under Hoover. It's insular, self-protective, it'll cover up. It's a subculture that is very arrogant. And we need an attitudinal adjustment for one thing, and we need different recruiting, and we need more psychological testing of FBI agents before they get in.
If I could follow up, sir. Is there a different kind of oversight required than what presently exists? I mean, what can we do to really fix the problem of mismanagement?
Well, years ago when I was in the FBI and immediately thereafter, Hoover was so untouchable because, I mean, if you attacked him, you were a communist. And he also had a tremendous public relations genius. There used to be a saying in Washington, an aphorism, that when other agencies blunder, they make excuses, and when the FBI blunders, it just makes another movie. And so he was untouchable. He was bulletproof. There was no going after him, and that continued and continued until the blunders now are so severe and so compacted that Congress finally has to exert some oversight. And I think they need a commission to go back and start over with the FBI. For example, under Louis Freeh, the FBI on its own initiative took on anti-terrorism overseas. Well, that's the CIA's jurisdiction. And besides, what would the FBI think if the Brits sent over, if the British embassy in Washington was bombed and the Brits sent 100 Scotland Yard detectives over to take over from the FBI? What would the FBI, they'd scream and yell. Well, they're doing the same thing to the Yemenis and the Saudis and the others. And all of those cases were solved by the local authorities, not the FBI. Yes?
It seems to me that what you're talking about is creating a new, more effective FBI, essentially a new and more effective political police in America. A political police seems to be a function in every democracy, France, Britain, and so forth. Democracies don't seem to function without them, but they're not particularly helpful for the citizens. Isn't it in our interest to have an incompetent, hidebound, useless FBI? Shouldn't we be thanking J. Edgar Hoover for his effective dismantling of the political police in our country?
Your logic is impeccable.
Bill, in your book, you talk about that the John F. Kennedy assassination files are closed for 75 years. Who did that, and is there any possibility in our lifetime that those will be unsealed?
Well, Lyndon Johnson ordered them sealed for 75 years, but that's been rescinded. Those files are now available thanks to Oliver Stone and his JFK movie. There was a surge in public sentiment to get those documents released. In addition, all documents released that had any relevancy. to the JFK assassination. So that has been done. There's a gold mine piled high of documents now that need to be correlated and sorted through and put into some perspective. But I think the answer is in those documents. There's no smoking gun, but there's plenty that can be stitched together to show it.
Shall we take one more question or two? This man here, and then we'll go to somebody way in the back.
Yeah, are you familiar with the Daryl Turney, Judy Berry case? There is this case coming before the FBI, and hopefully that might bring forth information about what they did in the bombing of their automobile. The Earth First activists?
Yeah, Judy Berry was the activist, environmental activist from North Country. And her car blew up in Oakland, and the FBI blamed her for blowing up herself.
Yeah.
There's impeccable logic, too.
Can we go way to the back?
Well, I worked with Mark Lane and Emile D'Antonio on the film Rush to Judgment and followed that case all the way through for years and years. And Mark Lane's criticism of Oliver Stone was that he didn't identify the agency, which he felt was, I think he proved it in his book Plausible Denial, was the group that killed the president was the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. And that was Mark's criticism of Oliver Stone. And here we are systematically lied to about every significant question of current political and world affairs and of world history. And we are systematically imbued with an upside-down worldview and errant methodology. And you've given a very eloquent exposition of the truth of that. And I think it's time that those of us who've read the Declaration of Independence take note of the section where it says it is our right, it is our duty, when the government becomes onerous and oppresses the people of the whole world to the degree that it does, to rise up and get rid of it. Thank you.
The lady in back there.
Right there.
Who do you believe assassinated John F. Kennedy?
Well, I think Garrison was on the right track when his investigation was aborted by the acquittal of Clay Shaw. But I think that it came out of the alliance between the mafia and the CIA to knock off Castro. And when the motives piled up, they simply switched targets onto John Kennedy. Vietnam was an issue. The lack of air cover at the Bay of Pigs was an issue. The rapprochement with Cuba was an issue. The failure to invade Cuba during the missile crisis was an issue. I'd say it was an issue with the CIA and with the Cuban exile charges of the CIA.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, William Turner.
Thank you, Elaine.
You just stay right here. This is definitely the way to spend a Saturday night. I would appreciate it if you would buy rear view mirror and then come up and have it signed. And if you'd like to have your name or someone's name put in it, Ginger and I will help you. Even, I suppose we will excuse Mrs. Turner, but everyone else, no matter how many years you have known him, please let us put your name in so that spelling is right and so forth. And for those of you who are watching on Book TV, you can order the book by calling 1-800-999-7909 or at bookpassage.com on the web. Thank you, William Turner, for a great book and a wonderful evening. My, you're well behaved. Good evening. I'm Elaine Petricelli, and along with my colleague, Ginger Gamali Hudson, we're really happy to welcome you tonight to Book Passage. And also to C-SPAN for Book TV. Because we are on Book TV tonight, when it comes time to answer questions, Mr. Turner will call on people, but it may take a minute or two for the man with the C-SPAN mic to get to you, so there'll be a couple of seconds before he can answer. I know that that'll work out really well. So I know that you've all gone out and had your hair done, and we're all ready. I'm really happy to be the one to introduce Mr. Turner tonight. I have read his articles over the years, and I am amazed at this book. A lot of you know about him, but I want to tell you a little bit. He joined the FBI in 1951, and he was a stellar FBI agent who went to all of the schools to learn how to break and enter and to destroy your privacy. He received many accolades from the then highly admired J. Edgar Hoover. But in time,
a few weeks ago, I was on with Phil Matier on television, and we were discussing the FBI. And I told his producer beforehand, I can't talk as fast as Phil. She said, nobody can. So if I don't talk that fast, I hope you'll understand that I'm not Phil Matier. The book actually is a cautionary tale in that all of the events described about the intelligence mafia in the United States come together to sound a warning to this day. The book is divided into 13 chapters, and I can talk a thumbnail sketch of each one. The first chapter is my abortive career as an FBI agent. I came in all bushy-tailed, thinking that the FBI was the greatest law enforcement organization in the world. And I left disillusioned that it wasn't. The problem was the Red Scare in those days. Hoover was making a big fuss about communist USA and ignoring organized crime because some of his buddies were mobbed up. And when I made an issue
to the Elian Gonzalez case and to our current administration, his information is detailed, it is important. There will be people who don't like the book, and I loved it. So I cannot tell you how much fun it is to read Rearview Mirror, looking back at the FBI, the CIA, and other tales, T-A-I-L-S. But more important than that, history will look at this book as an important chronicle of what really happened in the last part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. It shows how abuse and manipulation in the past affect the present, and it is very important. So I am proud to welcome William Turner to Book Passage tonight.
Thanks, Elaine, for your very generous introduction. And I hope that the book lives up to the expectations that you raised for it. And thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you, Elaine, for inviting me to Book Passage. I got some illustrations here I'll be using later. With this inside the FBI, I became the first whistleblower. I wrote to Congress, poking the tiger from inside the cage, asking for a congressional investigation of the FBI. Well, 40 years later, there may be one. In the meantime, I saw that the Bureau was developing willy-nilly by its own light. Congress did not have a firm hand on the steering wheel. It was driving practically no-handed. The FBI did what it wanted. So did the CIA, and that's what we have today. The blunder after blunder after blunder, and they're not doing their job. So my recommendation was 30 years ago, and it persists to this day, that they do more extreme psychological testing to get a better grade of agent in there, and that they separate or spin off the espionage and counter-espionage responsibilities into a separate agency that recruits more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan people for the very slow, nuanced investigations that we're talking about when we're talking counter-espionage and espionage. The second chapter is Oswald and the...
He became quite disenchanted with Mr. Hoover and the way that the FBI was run, and he turned in his service revolver for a typewriter and became a great investigative journalist. I believe it is because of William Turner that the FBI now requires that you sign something, and I think the CIA too, saying you will never say another word without their approval. As a journalist, he works to ferret out the truth and shoot down the myths. He has exposed malfeasance in our government, in the CIA, in the FBI, in some of the most important myths and lies of our time, the Kennedy assassination. And by the way, when he was doing his investigative work on the Kennedy assassination, the Hoover FBI put more people on watching William Turner than on trying to figure out who had killed JFK. The Robert Kennedy killings, the King killings, and when you read this book, you will find new and shocking information. Information about Charles de Gaulle, trying to make sure that JFK got elected. Operation Chaos with the farm workers and Cesar Chavez, where everything was being done to discredit him and them. The operations in Cuba, even